Cairdeas. Hello whisky fans. So I received an email from Laphroaig a few days ago and I find it a little hard to believe because it said that the Laphroaig Cairdeas was about to be released. And I thought, how can that possibly be, because we've just had a Cairdeas release. But I actually looked at my videos that I've uploaded and it has actually been an entire year since I reviewed the Laphroaig Cairdeas 2020, which was the port and wine cask release. So absolutely couldn't believe it that it's been a year already. It's been over a year since I've been doing these reviews, but it's true, there we have it. So another little bit of deja vu, this year's Cairdeas release from Laphroaig, which is kind of like a Facila release for Laphroaig, but they choose not to call it Facila. I think they're the only distillery on Islay that don't call their annual special release that comes out about the same time of year. They choose not to call it Facila, but it kind of is. Anyway, this year's release from Laphroaig is Laphroaig Cairdeas Pedro Ximenez cask strength. So it was a little bit of deja vu again there, because with last year's release being the port and wine cask release, which was second fill port barriques, bourbon casks and red wine casks, that sounded really unlikely. I didn't really expect it to be very good, but it turned out to be very, very good. So I had kind of the same reaction when I saw this one with Pedro Ximenez casks on the label. I thought, is this going to be another PX cask Laphroaig or the Broadair release that they did a few years ago? Because those two releases, the PX cask Laphroaig and the Broadair, they are actually my two lowest rated Laphroaigs that I've ever tasted. So when I saw that this was going to be a PX release, I was a little bit like, yay, Cairdeas, and then PX. But it may not be as bad as that, because if you read the details on the tube and the label, it is PX cask, but it's actually more of a kind of Laphroaig triple wood PX, whereas the Broadair and the PX cask, I believe that I think they were both finished in PX, so most likely bourbon cask and then re-racked into the PX sherry casks. This one is actually matured, triple matured, in first fill American oak bourbon barrels, so that's the same sort of thing that you'd get for most Laphroaig releases, like the 10-year-old cask strength and the 10-year-old 40 or 43% release. They are predominantly matured, solely matured in American oak ex-bourbon casks, and then this one is matured in American oak ex-bourbon quarter casks. So something like the Laphroaig quarter cask, where they're giving it a finishing period in very small, high surface area contact virgin American oak to give it lots of oak influence in a very short period of time. And then this one has its third maturation in European oak hogsheads that originally contained PX sherry. So PX sherry is not something that I get excited about. It's a nice drink on its own. It's very, very sweet, and it's kind of the slag of the sherry world. It's like the pot noodle of the sherry world, because it's got lots of sweetness, but it's really seen by serious sherry drinkers as your bottom shelf sherry. Most sherry drinkers will go for the drier or the medium dry sherries, the really high quality stuff as most people see it, whereas PX is more playful, more self-indulgent. It's just not the same quality level as the sherries that most people go crazy for. And it's kind of the same in the whiskey world. Obviously, sherry casks have a long history in the whiskey world of being used for maturation, and you can do some wonderful things, especially if you mature full term in a sherry cask. But PX, because it tends to be a very heavy, very sweet, very cloying type of sherry, it has a horrendous habit of covering up whiskies and taking out as much flavour as it puts in. But what I will say is it's really good that they specify on the tube here that it is European oak hogsheads that they've used for the PX maturation of this whisky, because a lot of companies, they take just bourbon casks and treat those with sherry, or they assemble hogsheads from a mix of bourbon barrels and whatever they've got, and they treat those with sherry, and they sell that as a sherry matured or sherry finished whiskey. With this one, we know that they have actually used genuine European oak, so that's a good thing. And we do also have to be sort of aware that last year's Cairdeas release seemed really unlikely with its mix of red wine and port, but it was really good, so I'm going to try to be open-minded with this one. Other details from the tube and the label: it is cask strength. Now, seeing that on the label, I wasn't actually sure if all Cairdeas is cask strength. That's a good question. A lot of it is, and it's always high strength, but maybe that's one that one of the Cairdeas anoraks can answer for me. Is all Cairdeas always cask strength, or is it just high proof? So the ABV of this one is 58.9 alcohol by volume. It is Laphroaig Islay single malt, and it's a Cairdeas release. For anyone that doesn't know, Cairdeas means friendship in Gaelic. So this release is, as I said, first fill American oak ex-bourbon barrels, American ex-bourbon quarter casks, and PX sherry hogsheads. It is bottled at cask strength. I don't believe it actually mentions whether this is barrier filtered anywhere, so it may be chill filtered, but a little bit unclear on this one. Another thing that they don't mention is I can't see any mention either way as to whether this is an artificially coloured whiskey, so it's still possible that in 2021 Laphroaig are still polluting their whiskey with caramel colourant. So that's really, really disappointing. They obviously think that it doesn't matter either way if they tell us or not, and it gives them the option to do a U-turn and start colouring it when they didn't before, if that's the case. So it's just underhanded, it's just disappointing. They obviously think it doesn't matter. They're wrong. Anyway, let's get some on the glass. So, as I mentioned, this one is 58.9% ABV, so it's a very strong whiskey. It's probably about the ABV that you'd expect after 10 years. But from my experiences with this whiskey so far, it's not too bad at full cask strength. I have tried it with water as well. Swims reasonably well. You're always a bit worried with sherry and wine matured whiskies, or finished whiskies in general, to be honest, that they won't swim that well, because quite often if it's finished, or if it's a very old sherry matured whiskey, sometimes they just completely fall apart when you add water, but not really too much the case with this one. It does quite well. So if you don't like your whiskies at high proof, this one will do you well. We'll just mention that the colour on this one is quite astounding. That's a very stunning colour, but as I said, we don't know if it's a natural colour because they haven't bothered to tell us. So on the nose. So very obviously PX in there. You can really tell, if you're familiar with PX whiskies, you'll definitely smell straight away that there's lots of PX in this one. Getting big aromas of raisins and chocolate and a little bit of honey in there as well. A little bit of a sulphury note, but not too much at all. But there really is a heavy note of grape on the nose of this whiskey. Grapes and sweet raisins. Also getting a little bit of a fuminess to this one, so the sort of notes that you'd get from a vehicle exhaust. And I think what that is, it's the peat that you're getting from the Laphroaig, because as far as I'm aware, this is the standard Laphroaig mash bill, standard Laphroaig phenols, parts per million and all that. But there's really not a lot of peat on the nose of this one. What you do get, because you have that combination of the really strong PX sherry notes with the Laphroaig peat, which I assume is there, it comes across as a rather dark, fumy, really quite dirty, but not necessarily that peaty quality on the nose. The peat is definitely there, but if you didn't know that this was a Laphroaig, I can see a lot of people not identifying it as such, because what really stands out to a great extent with this whiskey, on the nose especially, is the lack of peat. So it's a nice nose, and it's got a little bit of intensity to it, but it's very dark and brooding. It's quite fun, but I have to say that it's a little bit plain and a little bit simple. Let's see how it tastes. So again, on the palate, it's a similar story to the nose. Not exactly the same, but it really follows up in a similar vein. It's quite subdued on the palate, getting a strong taste of wine gums. So that's really that sort of jelly confectionery and dark fruitiness that you get from the PX. It really takes over. It really obliterates the peat quite a lot. You're not getting that much maltiness, not much peat, not much smokiness. It has that PX cask. It's removed a lot of what makes this whisky a whisky. I'd say that on the palate it's very sweet, it's quite fun, it's not underpowered, but because of that PX cask it does come across as a bit simple. Let's have another sip. Again, quite a bit of chocolatiness on the palate, the same as I found on the nose. Getting quite a bit of blackcurrant and lime. So I quite like that, to be honest. I like lime and sour, aggressive fruity notes, spirity notes in all of my whisky, and it's good that I think that lime is coming through from the base distillate itself. And lime's not a tasting note that I'd normally associate with Laphroaig, but I'm getting that quite sour fruitiness that it does quite a good job of contrasting with the heavy PX sweetness. So that at least does something to make this a little bit less one-dimensional. Apart from that, on the palate, there's lots of those earthy dark fruit notes, a little bit of wood spice, but again, it's not particularly peaty. This is really not your stereotypical Laphroaig. And to be honest, I'm not that convinced. It's going to have another sip and have a look at the finish. So again, I think the thing that really saves the finish on this one is that sour fruitiness, that note that I described as lime on the palate, that really lingers through the finish, and it's really quite good. I think it's probably due to how robust the Laphroaig spirit character is. That means that whereas this PX treatment could have been a very one-dimensional, very dull, boring, overly sweet experience on another whisky, that sour fruitiness coming through from the base spirit, it really gives a little much needed boost of character on the finish. I think there's quite a saltiness to the finish as well, and I think that's coming through from the Laphroaig malt, it's come through from the distillery character, as well as the PX cask, because you do quite often get quite a salty savouriness from a lot of sherry casks. You probably see it more with the dry sherries, but I think with this PX cask finish as well, you are also getting a little bit of added saltiness from that too. I'd say that the finish is medium length, it's not underpowered. I have to emphasise that this is not an underpowered whisky, but the finish, as with the rest of this whisky, it just comes across as a little bit undefined, a little bit simple, almost featureless, and a little bit lacking. You can see that there's been lots of sherry influence with this whisky, and it's worked reasonably well. It's not been a disaster, but it's not that well integrated with the malt or the peat. I think that PX cask treatment, it sits in front of this whisky like a wall, and it's a wall that blocks out a lot of other flavours. It adds a little bit of its own, but I think it takes out more than it adds in. And I think with this whisky, it's definitely better than the normal PX cask Laphroaig or the Laphroaig Brodair, because you can tell that the whisky underneath this cask treatment is really good stuff, and that carries it enough that this is still a nice whisky. But the way that PX cask really gets in the way and subdues so much of this whisky, especially the peat. What's a Laphroaig without peat? But that PX, it really covers up so much of it, it's just not there. And that's really why, as always, I'm that bit sort of cautious of anything that's got PX mentioned. I do really appreciate that they've used genuine European oak in this one, and I have to keep saying I do think this is a good whisky, but for a Cairdeas release and for a Laphroaig release, especially at high proof, it should be that little bit better. And saddest of all, I think that from what I can taste of the base distillate from this one, I think without the PX treatment, it would have probably been a really good whisky, because you can tell that they have selected some good casks to give the PX treatment to. But all in all, this one for me, I think it's a little bit of a miss. As for a grade, I'm going to give it a C+, and possibly being a little bit generous with that. It's not a bad whisky by any means, but I think for the price it's probably not quite good enough. Suffers from a lot of the same problems that the Laphroaig PX and Laphroaig Broad Ear did, just nowhere near as bad, and I think that's probably because they have handpicked, curated the casks that go into this. So that's a little bit of a disappointing Cairdeas release. Not awful, but you really want more than that, don't you? So how about we give Laphroaig a second chance in the next video.